Kana, that's exactly right. We were just searching for a resolution here. We want the four Americans that are now detained. One was released because he had terminal cancer and it was a compassionate release back to the United States. But the four that still remain, we just want a resolution here. If something like this occurred where you had 2 rounds of ammunition in the United States while going through border and customs, this would be handled with a fine, no jail time, and you'd be sent back to your country of origin. Here, on the other hand, these five Americans were traveling from Turks and Caicos back to the United States, had minimal amounts of ammunition. We're talking 2 rounds in one case, a handful in the other, and 20 rounds in another case. They did not know these rounds of ammunition were in their luggage, and then they're facing now, instead of just a fine and being sent back to the United States, they're facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 12 years in prison. A prison, by the way, that the UN has flagged for human rights abuses. So this is terrifying. It's to the point now, Kano, where every third week an American is being detained wrongfully in Turks and Caicos.
Every third week. Those numbers are staggering. This certainly is a terrifying situation. And while they may be admitting guilt to exactly what they're accused of, we are hearing stories, right, that I forgot these were in my bag. I hadn't used this bag since my last hunting trip. It does seem like this isn't something that is happening by accident, but it is still against the law in this other country. So how are you advising that they walk that line and they are allowed to make their own laws and uphold them, but also are you asking for a break for just American citizens, or should this be handled differently across the board?
Well, no, what they don't tell you, the Turks and Caicos government, is that they handle these cases differently for non-Americans. So, for example, there was a Brazilian that got caught innocently with rounds in her luggage, and she was allowed to leave, much as the Americans would do, with a fine and being sent back to her home country. So when it comes to non-U.S. citizens, there's a different standard. The Turks and Caicos government is targeting American citizens, putting them in front of their criminal justice system totally inappropriately, and that's the problem here. Additionally, 12-year mandatory minimum is unheard of for what's called a strict liability case. That's when you don't have what's called mens rea, or a guilty mind or evil intent. There was no intent here to break the law. All these Americans admitted that the rounds were accidentally left in their luggage. They weren't selling arms on the streets of Turks and Caicos. They weren't importing thousands of rounds of ammunition. These were clearly mistakes, and to face a 12-year mandatory sentence is inhumane, and that is not congruent with other nations in the Caribbean or the developed world for that matter. So just because the length of sentence is incredibly draconian, and how this law is being applied to Americans vis-a-vis other nationalities shows you that they are targeting American citizens. That's the problem.
Can you elaborate on that for us a little bit? Why, in your opinion, based on just being there, do you think they are, as you put it, targeting Americans here? Again, noting that this is a country and a nation that relies heavily on tourism.
They're totally dependent on the United States. It's a British protectorate, a British territory, but they're so tied in the United States that they use the U.S. dollar as a form of currency. Tourism is the vast majority of their economy. And from that tourism, the United States represents something like 86% of tourists coming into that country. Americans own 75% of the real estate, or 75% of the homes on the island. They're tied to us. But there's internal political pressures going on the island. There's basically 3 ruling families of Turks and Caicos Islands, and they're all jockeying for position. And the family that most recently came into power, that faction ran on a platform of cracking down on tourists, specifically American. And I can tell you that there's internal political pressure that is forcing them. I'm not justifying this, but it's having the premier and that ruling clique in Turks and Caicos target Americans and show to their constituents that they're going after Americans. And I can tell you, when I was down there for 2 days, there is a sentiment of anti-Americanism on that island. We were talking to the business community leaders. We were talking to the government. They were rolling their eyes at us, crossing their arms at us, making inflammatory statements about Americans. So this is not a government that is favorable to Americans, despite the fact that they're totally dependent on us for their economy. Also, we represent something like 75% of imports into that country. They're totally dependent on us. And to turn around and treat 5 American citizens this way is egregious.
I know that one of your constituents has a hearing set for this Friday, so I'm hoping that Congressman Reschenthaler, you will keep us updated and join us again, and we can talk more about this. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.